Probably most of you aren't readers of fishing news, but when you refer to the surveillance society and all these cameras, I read a horrifying thing today. Fishing news revealed that, as from sometime shortly, under the instructions of our leaders and our rulers across the sea, every fishing boat is going to have to carry a CCTV camera, so that as the fishermen go about their tasks, every action, whether they're trying to cheat on their logbooks or not, is all going to be recorded. And I thought I was sort of beyond being shocked by what's happening in the world today, but I must say, when I read that, and I think of some of the fishermen I know, and I think of the terrible lives they have, and the thought that somehow there's a spy in the cab for them all there, always going to be, is a very good example of why this Freedom Association has been called into being for the last, how many years is it now?
34. 34 years.
Yeah, well, by golly, hasn't the world changed? There are, I suspect, there are some people in this room looking around who can still remember the days when one of the common ritual phrases that used to be heard on all sides, particularly in school playgrounds, was, "It's a free country." I don't think in many school playgrounds you'd hear that being said today. Many years ago, decades ago indeed, as one has to say when one gets to my age, when I was editor of Private Eye, I designed a cartoon, which had to be drawn by someone else, of course, which had 3 frames. The first frame showed a whole gang of men walking down the street with placards saying, "It's a free country." The second frame showed a solitary man coming up the other way, holding a placard saying, "It's not a free country." The third frame showed all the guys who were holding the lot of placards, using their placards to bludgeon the fellow. And although it seemed like a joke in 1962, I think it's come rather closer to home these days. When I was first asked by my councillor, Ron Forrest, some months ago to address this splendid occasion, my first instinct was to say, well, was to think very hard about it, because I knew that I would be frantically, I'm not very good after the speaker, I'm not good at jokes. And the other thing, which was very much on my mind at that time, was that I was just coming back from India, where I was until this week, and I am preparing for the publication of an excellent book, which is coming out later. But the reason why I accepted the invitation was because Ron is a local councillor here, county councillor, district councillor, and over the years I've learnt very much to respect him, because he's that very rare thing in politics these days. He is a man who thinks for himself, does his homework, is independent-minded, and says what he thinks, in a quite quiet way, but very insistent. So he is very rare, and even more delighted was I this week when I heard that 2 other people were to be here, both of whom we referred to. One is Roger Helmer, who's another friend of mine, MEP, and the other is Sammy Wilson, who I've never met, but both of them, like Ron, are men who stand out in this sad, brave new world that we've been living in recent years, as that very rare thing, politicians who, as I said about Ron, who think for themselves, do their homework, and are then absolutely cussed in insisting on sticking by their principles and not bowing to the crowd. That pressure, which I'm afraid has turned almost all the vast majority at least, of their fellow politicians into mindless zombies. And you don't have to comment on that, Roger. But you know what I mean. So, now what was I going to say next? I've paid tribute to those 3 excellent men, and I shall probably come back to them later. But what I wanted to talk about tonight, for the last 20 years or so, as a journalist, I've found myself, wasn't intentional, but it's happened, covering what has been the most extraordinary revolution in the way our country is governed. And what I'm talking about is something that pervades our system of government now, all the way from Brussels, of course, which we all know about, down to the town and county halls, which Ron Forrest is so familiar with. Now, we have seen emerging a mysterious, highly complex new system of government, which more and more seems to have taken on a life of its own, removing it ever further from people it is meant to serve and from the real world. How many people, for instance, I'm not saying in this room, but even in the whole country, how many people could explain why it is, just why it is, that we have made such a total farcical shambles of the way our rubbish is collected? Very complicated, the answer to that question. So complicated that even if you asked 100 MPs, how does this system work, how did it come about, I bet not one of them could give a reliable, well-informed answer. The same applies to the utter shambles we're making of our postal services. How many people could give an informed 15-second, 15-minute, 15-hour lecture on why we are doing what we're doing and seeing the shambles that is being created? Now, which whole areas of government, as we know, which were formerly the centre, part of the centre of public debate in this country, agriculture, fisheries, lots more, are no longer discussed. They're hardly covered in the media. They're certainly not much discussed by our elected politicians, because the power to decide how those things should be run, our farming and our fisheries, both of which, well, certainly our farming is still quite important, and our fisheries is, as we know, sadly, far less important than it was in the days 30 years ago when we still had the largest fishing industry in Europe. So we see huge areas of politics, of what are the proper concerns of politicians, simply vanishing from the scene. Instead of which, we have this extraordinary, complicated, opaque system of government now, where things constantly are happening to us, laws are being passed, we read about, well, I mentioned the rubbish shambles. I mean, it is right across the board. The system of government we live under has become something that even our elected politicians really no longer properly understand. It has been one of the most obvious upshots of all this, and we're all again familiar with it, no one more than the Freedom Association, is how over recent years we've seen constant drips and drabs and erosions of our everyday liberties. I'm not going to reel off a lot of examples, because we can all think of ways in which we feel constantly government is closing in on us. I won't even mention the fact that some of us have had to go out and commit the sin of smoking outside this apartment. That is merely one complaint of a minority of people, but we all know what we're talking about. In other words, the idea that we still can say it's a free country has become something really quite absurdly remote from our present experience. Now, one of the oddest things about this is the way that nobody ever properly explains it to us, because, of course, nobody understands it. So much of the way we're governed now has become so opaque and so unaccountable that it can no longer, in any meaningful sense, be described as a democracy. We can't be described as a democracy. Most of the politicians we elect have become so interchangeable and so individually so powerless that they are just anonymous creatures of a system which even they don't really understand. Now, who can doubt, as we look at as we have done again this week, askance at the utterly degrading spectacle of all our MPs squealing and squabbling over their allowances, that there is some connection between the fact that they have been caught out wholesale in this ghastly fiasco, charade, and the fact that, as we have seen over the last 15, 20 years, more and more of the power and proper responsibilities of the people we elect to govern us in Westminster has simply been drained away, very often in an unexplained way, to this new system of government centred in Brussels, but with its tentacles through Whitehall, down into the town halls, through all the multitude of agencies which we keep on hearing of, new agencies to do, control our borders and our hygiene and health and everything else. I mean, we have got a system of government now which is almost entirely run by anonymous armies of officials, and the part played in the way we're governed by members of Parliament, elected politicians, has become smaller and smaller. And the result is we see, alas, this very degrading spectacle that we've been treated to by the Daily Telegraph and others over the last few months. There is definitely a very clear connection between the two.